Hi, my name is Saranne Gitnick. I was born at Clarkson Hospital in Omaha, Nebraska on August 12, 1942. My mother's name was Ethelyn Kulikowski Kaplan, Simon, and my father's name was Loyal George Kaplan. My mother was the daughter of Jacob Harry and Sarah Davidson, who died when my mother was 4 years old. And my grandfather, Jacob Harry, married Sadie Stark Kulikowski, who became very active in the Omaha Jewish community. My father's was born to Max and Hannah Kaplan. Hannah died when my father was 6 years old on the operating table in one of the hospitals in Omaha. He subsequently married, was Esther Potash, and they lived in Omaha, Nebraska for a while. My father, his brother Granum, and his sister Irene were all sent to live with their grandparents, who originally were from Omaha, the Adelsons, but subsequently moved to California. So my father grew up in California, and he kind of grew up on the streets of California, in the pool halls, and was kind of a wild kid. When he was finished with college, my grandfather, Max Kaplan, asked him to come back to Omaha to go to Creighton University. He went to Creighton, graduated from Creighton, then practiced ICC law, started ICC law, which is interstate trucking law, in Omaha. When my father first practiced law and graduated from law school, he practiced with Gitnick and Bieber. He was with that firm for several years, and that was the time that he started to go into ICC trucking, or interstate trucking law. He never in his entire career lost a case. When I was 10 years old, he divorced my mother and moved to Denver for a couple of years, but then subsequently did come back to Omaha. He married his secretary, who at the time was 3 months pregnant. So somewhere I have a half-sister by the name of Pamela Kaplan, maiden name, don't know where, but she is 10 years younger than I am, which would make her 53 today. At the time that my parents got a divorce, the entire community came to our house to sit Shiva. And it was at that time that my mother decided she better leave Omaha, because she was kind of living in a fishbowl. Now I'll take you backwards to my mother. I'll start with the divorce and we'll move our way backwards. We stayed in Omaha another 6 months, and then we moved to California. I want to go back and talk a little bit about her growing up years and her grandparents. She, as I said, was born to Jacob Harry Kulikowski and Sarah Davidson. And as I said, subsequently, Sarah Davidson passed away when my mother was 4 years old. My mother was born in 1918. She was born on a house on 50th and Dodge Street in Omaha, Nebraska. That house still stands today. It has antlers above the door. It's next to an underpass that crosses underneath the street, which was common in that time. The area that they lived in was fairly non-Jewish because it was an upper middle class neighborhood. And my grandparents had assimilated because they were both born in this country. And so even though they were raised with parents who were born in Russia, in a community called Lithuania, they had pretty much assimilated into the American way and wanted to assimilate in the American way. After my grandmother, Sarah Davidson Kulikowski, died, Jacob Harry married Sadie Stark Kulikowski. Sadie was a graduate of the University of California in Berkeley, and she was a ghostwriter for a professor there for several years. She was brought to Omaha to meet my grandfather, and they subsequently married. And she raised my mother, Ethelyn, my Aunt Beth Kulikowski-Smith, my Aunt Ruthie Kulikowski Belzer, and my Uncle Mike Kulikowski. The first two children were born to Sarah. The second two children were born to Sadie and Harry. But they were all raised as if they were one family. There was never a question if somebody had a different mother. My mother grew up feeling she was sort of an outsider, ugly child, but in reality she really wasn't. I'm sure she was mourning the loss of her mother for several years. She went to Benson High School and Central High School, graduated in 3.5 years, and also went to the University of California in Berkeley. She subsequently, after college, came back to Omaha, was a princess of Exarban, I believe one of the first Jewish princesses of Exarban, which was a social people of importance were honored, and it was just a social coming out, I suppose you would call it. She was very active in the synagogue, and as a matter of fact, my Aunt Ruthie, not to interrupt this, was the first child to be bar mitzvahed at Bethel Synagogue, which was on 49th Street, off of Farnham. My grandparents were very active in the synagogue, and so was my mother. To change the subject a little bit, let me go back to my grandfather and my grandmother, as a matter of fact. My grandfather, his three brothers, he had three brothers who were born in this country, and he had a sister and two brothers who were born in Europe. They were a very poor family when they came to this country. So when my grandfather, who graduated from Central High, got out of high school, he went into the grocery business. And it was a fairly large store for those days. And it was located on 16th and Harney. And he brought his brother in to work with him, and his cousin Reuben Kulikowski. The store was called the Central Market, and I've been told that during the Depression, when no Jewish boys could get work in Omaha, he would hire them. And during the Depression, my grandfather always said to the family, "Don't worry, people have to eat." But what he forgot is people could eat oatmeal instead of steak. So, but they seemed to manage through the Depression quite easily. And as a matter of fact, my mother went to college during the Depression. So that sort of says to you how they were living. And they had a car, and they had a fancy house, and they didn't do as many people did without. My grandmother, on the other hand, Sadie Kulikowski, became very active in the Jewish community and in the general community, in organizations like the Red Cross, the library, National Council of Jewish Women, the Jewish Federation of Omaha, Bethel Synagogue, and many, many other things. Very active in the instigation of raising money for the State of Israel. Made many trips to Israel in the early 40s before it became a state. My grandfather, the Central Market was divided into a couple of sections. My uncle Reuben Kulikowski, who I have been told created the sandwich, which is now called the Reuben sandwich, at a hotel in Omaha called the Blackstone Hotel, owned by the Schimmels. They used to play poker at the Blackstone Hotel, and he wanted a particular kind of sandwich, so he told Mr. Schimmel to create him that kind of sandwich, and what is today the Reuben sandwich, made with rye bread, coleslaw, cheese, I'm not sure, corned beef. And anyway, my Uncle Rube took care of the fruits and vegetables in the store. My Uncle Louis Kulikowski, married to Honey Kulikowski, he took care of the dry goods. And my grandfather took care of the meat. I have another set of grandparents that I really have not given a lot of time to and would like to talk about a little bit, and that is Max and Esther Kaplan. Even though Esther is not my natural grandmother, she was as if she were my natural grandmother and was always there whenever I needed something. They were very soft people, very giving people. You, as a grandchild, could never do anything wrong. When my parents were divorced, they were very angry with their son about the divorce, and they reached out to us as grandchildren rather than their son. They worked most of their life in Omaha, 24/7 at the laundry. The one thing I do remember about them in terms of their softness is as we were as children in Omaha, every Sunday or every Saturday, I can't remember, no, it must have been Sunday, because every Sunday they would take us to the donut shop and we'd each get a dozen glazed donuts. And to this day I like eating a dozen glazed donuts. But they always felt somewhat inferior to my Kulikowski grandparents. It was very obvious. I knew that as a child. But it didn't matter because they were the softer and the nicer set of grandparents, always giving. With J.H. and Sadie, you had to do the right thing. And that was what was important, not who you were. But they were both very good grandparents, each in their own way. My grandfather's responsibility, as I was saying, was to buy the meat and to run the back room in terms of the meat, but my grandfather was really the boss of the Central Market. He ran the Central Market, and he decided, he was the chief financial officer and the operating officer, and he told his cousin and his brother what was to be done. My grandfather also had a sister who lived in Council Bluffs by the name of Rosie Sachs, who had 7 children. The one I remember the most is Miriam Soshnick, who was one of her closest cousins. And every Sunday, the Soshnicks were a relatively poor family. So every Sunday, my mother and my brothers were taken to Council Bluffs to visit the poor relations, and that's the way it was put, sadly to say, in Council Bluffs. And I do think my grandfather financially did help them out. My grandfather also had a sister by the name of Hannah. I can't remember her last name, but she did marry a rabbi, and they lived outside of Omaha, in the Minneapolis area or something like that. Let's see, does that take care of all my grandfather's brothers? My grandmother, Sarah Davidson, grew up in Des Moines, and from immigrant parents who barely spoke English and certainly did not read and write English, but were the richest Jewish family in Des Moines. They ran a furniture. Originally, my grandfather started out as a peddler. My great-grandfather, not my grandfather, my great-grandfather started out as a peddler, but eventually he moved into a furniture store, the furniture store called Davidson's, which was in Des Moines and Minneapolis, and he did quite well at that. He barely spoke English. They also, in the early years in Des Moines, would take in boarders. And it was Saul, that your great-grandparents were Saul and Mary Davidson. Or I should say, my great-grandparents are Saul and Mary Davidson. And my mother, who was raised in a very it was a very restrictive family. There were a lot of rules. They did not live extravagantly. When she was taken to Des Moines, when she and my Aunt Bethy were taken to Des Moines and they would live there, they lived the life of Riley. They would buy them pretty clothes. They would, anything they wanted. It was like living in fairyland. And then they would come home to, you don't need another dress and you don't need another coat. Very practical, because Sadie was raised in the sweatshops of New York and was fairly frugal in terms of material things. She felt it was more important to give to the community of your time and of your money. And subsequently, I think all of her children turned out to be very philanthropic, as well as she did. Both my mother, my Aunt Bethy, and her 2 natural children, that you give back to the community. Okay, I have another set of grandparents. They are Hannah Adelson and Max Kaplan. They were married in Omaha, and as I said earlier, Hannah died, and the children were sent to California to live. The 3 children, Irene, who was 10, my father, who was 6, and Granny, who was 4. And they lived in California. Irene never came back. Granny came back for a few years to go to high school, and then went back to California, married an Omaha girl by the name of Betty Soroff, but they moved back to California. And my father came to Omaha, went to law school, and settled down in Omaha and married my mother. My grandparents, who I really grew up with, who were Max Kaplan and Esther Kaplan, ran the National Laundry, which laundered linens for restaurants. So whenever we would walk into a restaurant when we were with Max and Esther in Omaha, we got in. We were the first to get in. We always went to the first of the line. Now that's true with JH and Sadie as well, because JH sold all the meat to the restaurants. So it was nice living. Max and Esther spent most of their time working. They had one child by the name of Marilyn, and she grew up in Omaha, and then after college moved to San Francisco, where I became acquainted with her since I spent most of my growing up years in San Francisco. I mean in Oakland, which is across the bay from San Francisco. I was born in Omaha. When we first lived in Omaha and my father was practicing law, he was not home a lot. And so we lived, and when I was born, my father first worked in the bomber plant. I forgot about that. If you didn't go into the service, you had to, and if you were strong, you had to go work in the bomber plants. And that's what he did instead of going into the Army or the Air Force or the Navy. We lived next door to a couple by the name of Ann and Bennett Cohn, and they sort of became our surrogate grandparents. Because they lived next door, that we shared a driveway. My mother was home a lot with us, the three of us. We lived in a house that was 2 bedrooms, a living room and a kitchen, and dining room and a basement, and a little backyard with a swing set. And behind our house were cornfields, to the side of our house were cornfields. And it was a residential street, but really out into the country. As a matter of fact, I lived there until I was about 7 years old, and I used to walk across the cornfields and go to the stables on 72nd and Dodge to ride horses. How I learned to ride horses, I'm not quite sure. We lived in that house until my brother Charlie, which is your Uncle Charlie, was born. Oh no, we lived in that house until I was 7, and your Uncle Charlie was 5, and your Uncle Mike was 2. And the house became too small, and it was too hard for my mother to drive me to Dundee School because it was far away. We lived on 68th Avenue, and this was on about 50th Street. And that was a long drive in those days. So we moved to 52nd and Jackson into a larger house. I attended Washington School until I was 10 years old. I would say that I had a fairly happy childhood until my parents were divorced. And of course that was a sudden shock. And then 6 months after they were divorced, we left Omaha and we moved to California. And Grandma Ethelyn and a woman by the name of Velva Feldman drove us to California. It took us about a week to drive to California. It was probably one of the most horrendous trips I have ever taken. You had one 10-year-old kicking and screaming being let out of Omaha, and an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old. And we went to California in a 1950 Ford, and I think we fought the entire 7 days, the 3 of us in the back seat. And now, as to my growing up years in Omaha, they were just normal years. But growing up in Omaha, I can remember there was a store that was about 2 blocks away. And we could walk to that grocery store. The grocery store was named Walner's. And of course, most of our food came from the Central Market, and it was delivered to the house. But if we needed something, we could walk down to the store. And we crossed a busy street with a light, and I was maybe 7 years old. My brother was 5, and we could go all by ourselves. We were never, one of the things about me and my brothers is that we were never very good in the early years in school. We struggled in the early years of school. We have some learning disabilities, which run in the family, but we've all overcome them and done very well as adults. As to my life in California, the first couple of years I went to California, I was very quiet and withdrawn. My mother decided she had a choice. She could either be respectably poor or she could go into business. And she decided she wanted to go into business. She originally started, first of all, she went to work at iMagnets. Then she went to work at a baby furniture store. And then she went to work at a little dress shop. And she did this for about a year so that she could understand a little better of more of the retail business. Because when she was growing up in Omaha and she had come back from college, she wanted to go to work at the Central Market. And my grandfather says, a woman doesn't go to work, never. Anyway, her first venture was a small toy store about a mile from the house where we were living. Now understand, when we were growing up, we always had full-time help, and that included when we went to California, so that we were never children by ourselves, that the help would come at noon and stay until after dinner and clean up the dishes. So we always had somebody in the house taking care of us when she was off working. The first couple of years, she did the toy house and felt that, and it was on Lakeshore Avenue in Oakland, California, she felt that that wasn't a way to make enough money. So in 1954 was the beginning of Head Start in California. And she decided that the way to make money was to go into the school business, selling teaching aids to schools. She did very well with it. She then, when she was about 60 years old, she remarried and married a man by the name of Buddy Simon, who lived behind her in Omaha, Nebraska when she was growing up. And also, his wife, his first wife, was my mother's first or second cousin, and they went to Berkeley together. So they were very, very good friends. Buddy, or Lawrence Simon, his wife Phyllis, died, and then 6 months later after she died, my mother married him at the age of 60, gave up the school business called Lakeshore Learning Materials, and turned it over to my two brothers, which leads me to my two brothers. I have a brother, Charles Philip Kaplan, and a brother, Michael Allen Kaplan. Charlie is 2 years younger than I am, and Mike is 5 years younger than I am. When Charlie was growing up, during his growing up years, he was like a little scientist. He liked to blow up toilets, work with erector sets, and at 16 he built a car. Mike, on the other hand, was your playboy. Every girl in town and fast cars. He, as a young child, Mike was very sickly, and they weren't sure that Mike was going to survive. At the age of 5, he looked like he was somebody who came out of Auschwitz. But he's done very well for himself. He has 2 children. By birth, David, now called Bo, and another son called Josh. At the present time, Bo is married and has 2 children. One naturally by his wife who already had a wife. My brother Mike married Gail Cushman, and they lived together for about 20 years, were married, and subsequently divorced. And my brother Mike now has a second wife, Rose, and they have a child, age 3, by the name of Corey. My brother Charlie married his college sweetheart, Joanne Boutam, and they have 2 children, Lauren, who married Scott Packer, and Meredith. Both my brothers we all worked in the toy house and in the equipment company. We attended synagogue, and we celebrated all the Jewish holidays. My mother was extremely religious. We came from a kosher home. Although my brother Mike used to take TV dinners when she wasn't home, put them in the oven, and take them out on the back porch. As I've told you, I grew up from the time I was 10 in Oakland, California. I stayed in Oakland till I was 17. And then I went to school at the University of Arizona, and I taught in California. I want to talk a little bit about my life in Omaha, Nebraska. As a little child, I was quite shy, withdrawn. As I said, lived a very normal, what you'd expect life. My mother was very religious. And as I told you, we would sort of I had surrogate grandparents, Ann and Bennett Cohn. When I went to Dundee School until I was in kindergarten, so I guess I wasn't 7 when we moved. I must have been 5. Okay, I went to Dundee. No, maybe I went to 2nd grade. Can't remember. Wait a minute. Went to Dundee my first year or 2. Then I went to Washington School, and at Washington School, I made a few friends, not Jewish friends, although I was sent to Hebrew school. A Hebrew school that was very good, because when I went to California, I was so far ahead of them because of what I had learned at Hebrew school. I was a campfire girl. I went to camp. I went to the JCC camp. I went to a camp in Wisconsin, which was not a Jewish camp, but it gave me a chance to be with other people. As I said, I was taken out of Omaha screaming and kicking. I was mad at my parents' divorce. I was angry that I was being taken out of Omaha because my life was quite good. Sort of what you would say as a life of a princess. I think it's to my advantage I was taken out of Omaha because it made me look in other directions and have a fuller and a broader scope of life than if I had lived my entire life in Omaha, Nebraska. When I was 25 years old, my mother, Ethelyn, felt I was awfully old and really needed to get married, and I wasn't doing that. So she offered, I was a teacher, and so I wasn't making much money, and she offered to send me on a trip for the summer. I should go to Kansas City where there was a wedding. Bethy's Smith's oldest daughter, Sarah Shale, got married, and I went to her wedding, and then I was to go visit Grandma and Grandpa Kulikovsky in Omaha and stay at their house for a month. And that was fine because they were getting older, and I felt that was the thing to do, and besides, it paid my bills for the summer. But at that time, I had a cousin, Barbara Frankel, who lived in Omaha. And I said to Barbara, please, I do not want to sit home every night. I want to meet some people, and I'd like to go out. And Barbara said, sure. One of the people she fixed me up with was Jerry Gitnick, and we dated for 6 weeks, and 6 weeks later, we were married and came back to Omaha where he wanted to practice law. He'd already been in the law practice, and so we came back to Omaha. Omaha was an adjustment for me. It was a very social community, and I was a little inept at the social skills. Besides, I came back to Omaha, I was wearing short skirts out of California, and they kind of looked at me kind of funny. But I was very accepted when I came back to Omaha. I was accepted because I was born in Omaha. My grandparents lived in Omaha. They were prominent. I should say the grandparents Kulikovsky. The Kaplans had subsequently left Omaha and moved to California. And I was also a newcomer when we got married. So Omaha, which is it has real advantages. But you are in a fishbowl. Everybody at least thinks they know your history and who you are and what you're doing. When I came to Omaha, I taught for about 6 months, and then I got pregnant with our oldest daughter, Nan, and Jerry felt it was not appropriate for me to work. So we built a house on 122nd and Farnham. We moved in there when I was 8.5 months, I was 8.5 months pregnant, and 2 weeks later, Nan was born. We lived a very standard Omaha life, which was a very social life. People were very friendly and would include you. And I stayed home and learned to drive in ice and snow, which I never had done before. But that took me about 9 months. So I stayed home with Nan for about 9 months without getting out. We only owned one car because your father said that's all we could afford. That wasn't quite the case, but that's what he told me. Subsequently, 2 years later, Andy was born, and I asked to have help in the house, and Jerry didn't believe in it. So both Nan and Andy went to daycare a couple of days a week, which was a new phenomenon for Omaha, Nebraska. But it worked out fine. And I was uncomfortable staying at home every day. That's just who I was. I loved both children a lot. But the appliances, that's who I talked to all day long. So I decided to get into the volunteer community because Jerry at that time felt it was inappropriate to work. And I was raised in an environment where everybody worked. I worked from the time I was 12 years old. So I wasn't used to staying home all the time. I started out my volunteer work at Bethel Synagogue, sitting on the school board, and I did some volunteer work at the PTA at the school, that Columbian school that Nan and Andy attended. But I really got into volunteer work when integration came to Omaha. And because I had been raised in Oakland, California, which is a very mixed community, I found Omaha to be very white. And when my children walked down the street in Oakland, California and asked me why somebody's skin was brown or red or yellow, that made me nervous. So when integration came to Omaha, I felt it was very important that my kids be exposed to integration. So I used to go around with the principal at Columbian School and with some of the board members of the Omaha board, school board, and we would talk about the positive effects of integration. At the same time, Jerry decided he wanted to become a judge and got on the bench in the state court, or what's called the district court in California. I mean in Nebraska. What was interesting is when Jerry got on the bench and I was working for integration, there was some publicity in the Omaha World Herald, which was the newspaper, and Jerry and I used to get threatening calls for months that we better keep our noses to the grind and get out of town, but it didn't scare us. They're just calls, they're just people who are frightened. I think your father was one of the first Jewish judges in Omaha for the state court. After the integration, I worked on a project called Seven Can Help, and we created a consumer advocate for Channel 7 in Omaha, Nebraska. I did that with 3 other girls, and we did that for about 9 months. That was Bobby Leibowitz, Leanne Goldberg, and one other woman, her name escapes me at the moment. From there, I had become involved with the Jewish Community Center. I started out on their athletic committee. I created a women's athletic committee. I also worked on the preschool committee to create, when the building was being built for the Jewish Community Center in Omaha, you had to create the preschool and what it was going to look like and who we were going to hire to run the preschool. And so I worked on that committee. I started the Children's Committee, which created Club 56, which is now a national. Club 56 is a program for 5th and 6th graders to have a little club. And that's done countrywide now. And I also created Club 78. From there, I went on to the Jewish Community Center Board of Directors. I was a vice president and president of the Jewish Community Center. I also became involved in the Nebraska Jewish Historical Society and was president for a year of the Nebraska Jewish Historical Society. And then I was also president of the Jewish Federation of Omaha. And that sort of concludes my volunteer work in a little capsule. I really enjoyed my volunteer work. It was very exciting. It was a very good learning experience, and I enjoyed it a lot. In '93, Jerry and I decided that he retired from the bench, and we decided we would come to Phoenix, Arizona and see if we'd like to live here part of the year. We did that for a couple of years, and then we moved to Phoenix, Scottsdale on a permanent basis in 1997, leaving Omaha. And it was hard to leave Omaha and all of our friends behind, but we're having a wonderful time here. It's like being on a vacation all the time. I know my volunteer life took time away from our daughters, Nan and Andy. But in our family, giving back to the community is part of what you do. There are three things that I'm probably the proudest of and did during my volunteer career. One was the Integration Task Force. Whether I had an impact or not, and I think I did, it at least gave both of my children the importance of being open with all kinds of people. With the Jewish Community Center, the creation of some of the programs and the directions of keeping the Jewish Community Center alive and well outside of an athletic department was very exciting for me. And the third accomplishment was probably the Federation. In changing when I came into the Federation had raised the same amount of dollar for 10 years. For a 10-year period, it had been flat. So something had to change in order to raise the amount of money that could be raised for the community, because the amount of money that could be raised for the community is what you could throw back in terms of the institutions, in terms of the community. And with inflation, you needed to raise more dollar. So I would say probably with the Federation was changing the techniques and the ways of raising dollar to raise a greater amount of dollar for the community. As all of you may or may not know, but I think you do know, family is the most important part of our lives. Whether it be our children or our grandchildren, your sisters, your cousins, your brothers, family has always been key. We call ourselves the Gitnick 10. Myself, Jerry, Nan and Dan, Andy and Brad. Now understand that both Dan and Brad have been, although my children have only been married 8 to 10 years, Dan and Brad have been in our family for about 22 years. Both Andy and Nan dated their husbands, lived with their husbands, about 10, 11 years before they got married. To all of you, each and every one of you, you are key and critical. I love you, and there is no one else more important than Jerry, Nan, Andy, Brad, Dan, Ashley, Zachary, Nicole, and Tara. Many things come into our life: health, money, family, friends, charity. Now I ask you, what's number one? To me, number one is family. Number two is charity. The other, health, that's important. The others can go by the wayside because people are more important. Family is more important than any other thing in life.